Me and my girlfriend as well as our kids, one being 3 years old, the other 4 years, were tent camping in eastern Washington one summer at a campground. It was a nice campground but not many guests at all since it was before peak season. We had a site with no other campers visible to us. One night at approximately 1 a.m., my now ex-girlfriend and I were sitting by the fire while our kids were sleeping in the big tent that we all were sharing. A beat-up old Ford Explorer slowly drove by our campground and proceeded to keep driving around the campground out of sight. I thought it was odd, but maybe just someone looking for friends or a campsite. We went to bed and I woke up early the next morning, maybe 5 a.m. to go to the bathroom, and there was the same beat-up Ford Explorer at the campsite adjacent to ours, maybe 60 feet away. And mind you, there were dozens of other open campsites around, so my alarms were certainly raised by this. After going to the bathroom and returning to our tent, where my kids and girlfriend were still asleep, I saw a man standing behind the Ford Explorer with only his head visible, trying to hide himself, looking directly at my tent. I stood there and stared right back at him for about 45 seconds and raised my hands up in the air like, "What the fuck are you looking at?" I didn't want to cause a commotion and wake the kids up, and he just continued to stare. I sat in one of my camp chairs and kept eyes on him and watched him get into his car, which was faces us, but I couldn't see what he was doing in there. About an hour later he started his car up and slowly drove right by our site and stared directly at me, maintaining eye contact the entire pass, about 25 feet away. I know for a fact this guy had ill intentions just by his demeanor and looks of him. Likely would have done something had I not been there. This happened many decades ago, but it still puzzles me to this day. Here goes. My buddy and I, who were in college at the time, were back in our little hometown for the weekend. That Saturday night, we were driving around, getting high and drinking beer. We were driving around on dark country roads, and it was pitch black that night, overcast with no moon. Anyway, we stopped on a dirt road to take a leak and roll another joint. My buddy, who was driving, left the car running but turned off the lights. We didn't see any other cars or people around us for miles. So my buddy starts rolling the joint, and the overhead light inside the car is on. Then he happens to glance up toward the front of the car, acts startled and flips on the headlights. We look out the car windows and see a whole group of guys around the car. We both yelled, "Oh shit," or some other choice of words. He slammed the car in gear, and we got out of there without a moment's notice. Those guys were probably people we knew from town. I even thought I recognized one of them. But I've always wondered what in the hell they were doing out in the middle of nowhere, on a pitch-black night, without flashlights, and apparently on foot. The mysterious man saw the ominous gloomy house with desolate features and an eerie aura. The foreboding feeling was haunting and filled the room with terror and dread. The man came at me with anguish and is clever. I was all up in the insanity and felt a wave of stress-induced claustrophobia feelings. I made an immediate shriek as I tackled the lunatic down. It gave me chills and I could smell the rotting stench and musty gust of putrid air. I could smell the aroma of his waxy cyst-filled face. Eyes so rotten they stared like two black olives at midnight. Then I took my baton out and began beating and sparring with the grumpy old man. His face was like a mirror and ugly. The groans of his loud sighs could be heard. I could feel his skull press against my heavy baton and I felt as his dagger slowly went into my right thigh. The pain I sighed was immense and full of hurt. I could sense a presence of a Madonna. I could hear delicate harps being strung outside and from the tin roof amongst the rattling of rain, falling upon it in an almost music-like rhythmic harmony. The stench of the wrecking man as he plowed his nails into the splintered dry wood and rode at me like a wolverine. I screamed in agony as his sharp claws digged into my flesh, blood spewing out of my combat wounds. It was quite a sight to behold. Suddenly, the door flied open, and my comrades sat there and looked. I shouted at them for help, but they stared and watched me. Then my friends jumped on the man attacking me and began to restrain him. He was screeching for his mother. We took to ourselves to interrogate the men, but then out of nowhere arrived a chopper from the sky. It tilted down and flashed its light into our compact room and quickly with haste began to accelerate rapidly towards us, and then I looked out of the window, and I saw her. It was the Virgin Mary. She was in the cockpit staring down at us, as she piloted. Then suddenly it disappeared and we quickly and fastly with swift speed forgot about the whole incident. Then we talked. The old man asked him about the body. He said yeah and showed where it was, and then he went prison afterwards. This is a true story from several years ago now. So, for about 6 months I rented out a basement from a family. I lived in another state for work. It was just convenient and cheap at the time and worked out for everyone. The basement was unfinished, but had studs up where the walls would be, had heat, but a cement floor, and living in the northern part of the United States during the winter, it regularly got quite chilly at times down there. So much so that I had 2 space heaters to keep warm. The family who owned the house had quite a bit of stuff piled up in the basement as well. They were mild pack rats, not hoarder level, but you could tell they hadn't unpacked everything from their last move, bags and boxes and totes and everything piled up. I had the one central area to myself where I had my bed, my TV was set up, a few chairs and whatnot. It was like a small studio apartment. Anyways, I've had some paranormal experiences over my life. But this was on a new level. It began probably a couple months after I moved in. I started feeling uncomfortable, I guess is the best way to describe it, when I would go to bed for the night. I'm not usually one to be terrified of the dark, but I began to sleep with a light on in the next room over. Uncomfortable, like I didn't feel okay in the dark and closing my eyes. I'm not sure, just weird, I guess. As weeks went on, as I would sit down there and play my Xbox or watch TV when I was not working, I would see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye, walking between the wall beams in the next room over. This was obviously concerning, but having had experiences before, I wouldn't say terrifying. Just like, oh, that's creepy. It was a fairly regular occurrence, maybe once or twice a week. Then the dreams started. I had recurring nightmares about a female apparition, very scary looking with long flowing dark hair. The dream always took place in a house I didn't recognize, and I knew the spirit was in there with me, but I didn't know where. It would always jump from behind a corner and scare the crap out of me, and I would try to run away from it, but I couldn't move fast enough, and just before it caught me I would snap myself awake. Those were the worst part of my experience there. I would wake up shaken and usually sweating and out of breath. Finally, I asked the homeowner if anyone had ever told her that there was something in her basement. I remember her face went pale a bit, and she told me that other people had reported things happening down there from time to time. There were some examples, but I don't recall what they were now. But I do remember that she told me she had some belongings down there that once belonged to her first fiancé. He had killed himself many years prior, but she had hung onto some of his stuff. I found my own place shortly after moving out. The dreams immediately stopped, no more shadows, it totally stopped after leaving. Thank God.